Welcome back to the Pastors Podcast. Pastor Scott here with Pastors Matt, Jim, and Brian.
Hello.
Hey.
For Cornerstone History, Volume 8.
This is intense. There's a lot of history here.
We're getting deep.
We're catching up.
We
That's
need
right.
violins in here in the background.
That's right. So
I can't wait until we get to the ones where we predict what's going to happen in the future. Volume 25.
11?
Here's what I think will happen.
Question marks in front of the titles.
Yeah, Christians are pretty good at predicting the future in my experience.
I have some charts. I have some charts that could be helpful.
Not something we've avoided entirely in the last 50 to 100 years.
So we are, in today's episode, going to talk about, this is kind of a big episode. We're going to talk about the church merger that created Cornerstone Church of West Los Angeles.
The merge.
That's right. We've been talking about the history of First Baptist Church of West LA. We've been talking about, in the last episode, we talked about the history of Shoreline. And it was in the coming together of these two churches that Cornerstone, that the name, what we know currently as Cornerstone Church of West LA, was formed. And so we're kind of moving from these two distinct paths, both of which are obviously a part of our history, but into kind of the modern iteration of this. And so these two churches came together. We merged in 2011, but the story starts a little bit before that. Jim, where did this idea come from? How did I'm going to make you start it.
Make Jim do it.
I am. What?
Why are we here?
Yeah. Like, church merging's a really weird idea.
Totally. I think it must have been someone had a bad dream. I'm not sure.
Yeah.
No, the truth is, what I hear, this is the story I was told.
Well, this is going to be fun because
Okay,
I think
fair
we're all
enough.
going to
Yeah,
tell
okay.
4 different stories.
All
Things
right,
like that. Let's get back. So what's the story
I
you were
heard
told?
was that our youth pastor at the time was Kevin Elwell, whose name was mentioned before, and you and he were talking one day, and you were talking about the churches.
You're pointing at Scott. Just we're on
yes,
audio.
yes,
Just clarify.
See my
So
finger?
for people at home. Yeah.
That's right.
And somewhere, I guess it was you, as you were leaving, you're saying, we should just merge our churches together. It's great. Or something like that. And Kevin said, that's not a bad idea. Or some version of that is what I heard.
Okay,
began.
so
That was a spark.
that's
You tell
interesting.
me.
That is an interesting version.
Yeah. So things were flipped a little bit there. So
okay.
I think so. First Baptist was in this situation where Jerry Wilkie had retired,
Yes.
and they were looking for or in the process of beginning to look for a new senior pastor.
Correct.
Right. And I believe Kevin and Steve Campbell may have talked about it before, but Kevin actually called me because I'll never forget this. I mean, I remember exactly where I was standing in my backyard talking to Kevin, and he's like, what if instead of us hiring a new senior pastor, what if we just merged our churches together? And I distinctly remember it because I remember the first thing that hit my brain, which was, that's a horrible idea.
Was this at what time have we sat down with Kevin at Champagne Bakery
No.
yet? Like, okay,
No.
so he brought up the merge first? I
Yeah.
don't remember that because I thought we went to that meeting being like, are they going to try and hire us? Like,
In light of their
Well,
need for a pastor?
yeah.
is what it was?
Yeah.
Okay.
Like, it was kind of like, it was a rough idea like
Okay,
that. Like,
okay.
and he was like, can we meet?
yeah,
And
okay.
and I was like, sure, Brian and I will like meet with you, but I don't know what's going to come of it, but we'll hang out. And
Okay.
Kevin and I had become friends. So during those years, the years prior, a few years prior, I think I may have told this story, but I was teaching PE, as the athletic director at West LA Baptist School here at the school that was here. And that's how Kevin and I met, because I needed a job when we planted the church. And which, for the record,
Yes.
I think we need to defend Brian. I think we need to stop and defend Brian from your attacks in the sermon this morning.
I mean, they were...
Tax.
Is it a tax if it's just truth? Name your
Attacked with facts.
Name your marketable skills, Brian. Let's see.
The barista thing is high up for me. That's
Dude,
true.
and what's funny is that's true too. That totally did happen.
That story actually did happen.
Yeah.
But when we planted Shoreline, it wasn't like Brian wasn't willing to be bivocational. He was just like, hey, why don't you just give me rent plus $100 and I'll survive.
That's actually not that far off, I don't think. I think we actually had that
Rent plus
conversation.
$100 a month.
I think I said something close to that.
To be fair,
Anyways,
Matt was.
you did.
that
You
was
did.
close.
So I was working at the school, and Kevin and I became friends and would teach Bible together. And then the school shut down, and it was a couple years later that Kevin called, and we sat down with him just to have this kind of preliminary conversation, which again, to me, reminds me of how incredible the direction of God is when we never set out to merge with a church or set out to, we kind of had assumed we wouldn't ever have a facility on the west side for the entirety of the life of the church. But God was doing things that we couldn't even see at the time.
Everyone around this table was actively against it for a decent amount of time.
All four of us were.
Like, we were all just sort of like, yeah, on first blush.
Yeah, I don't think that works.
This is that maybe we can be like sister churches. So basically we start having these conversations with Kevin at Champagne Bakery, and we realize like we do have a lot in common. Is there a way we can kind of partner up? West LA can be a hard place to be a church, and we can kind of be sisters and support each other. And there's ways we kind of like complement each other. That's pretty cool, demographically and in terms of vision and leadership and all these things that we kind of like could really come together and support one another. And there was kind of a like, well, what if we merge? Like, nah. I mean, we were pretty actively not interested in that.
It feels like a pipe dream, right? It feels like something fantastical that is just a simple idea that is way more complicated, it just feels impossible.
And when
to
you look into the
imagine.
logistics, it's like, there's no way it's like actually going to work.
And there was so many risks, and not even risks, just like, it just felt like that would go poorly.
Yeah.
It wouldn't just be hard. Like that just wouldn't be a good idea. That was just like the vibe at the table.
Like Shoreline
except for Kevin.
Shoreline at that time.
Yeah, except for Kevin.
Shoreline at that time is meeting in the movie theater, like we talked about last episode. It's a lot of college students, 20-somethings. There's maybe one or two. They're your kids, there's a few other kids. It's not it felt opposites in some ways, but then you started thinking about it and you're like, compliments. Oh, we actually fit like a puzzle in some ways that we didn't realize at first. So I want to defend our initial assessment because it felt incredibly impossible to imagine what it could be like.
I mean, Jim, I'm pretty sure the words you used were cautiously pessimistic.
Yes.
Okay, so so at this point, we're getting together somewhat. It's probably like the third or fourth time Scott and I have sat down with Kevin at Champagne Bakery, which I think is gone now, but was on Sawtelle and Olympic.
No champagne there, by the way.
No, Matt was sorely disappointed when he showed up for one of these.
But basic coffee and
really mediocre coffee.
And mediocre
pastries.
Yeah, you get like a croissant.
Yeah.
But so like we at that point we were sort of like the merge thing had kind of come up enough where we're like, okay. So Kevin's like, I'm gonna bring Jim. So we had never met Jim. So Jim comes to Champagne Bakery, and Kevin, with some excitement, and us sort of like, we're all of a sudden kind of thinking about this, explained to Jim this idea, which I kind of thought Kevin would have prepped you with, and maybe he did a little bit. And Jim,
but it seemed like Jim was hearing it for the first time at the table.
Yeah, it was. That's exactly
That's
right.
what you said. You said, I'm cautiously pessimistic.
Yeah.
Which is the first time those two words I'd ever heard put together side by side.
If I remember correctly, I think we had gone around and asked everybody, like, how do you feel about this? How do you feel about this?
Yes.
I think Jim was like the last person. So I was like, Steve Campbell, how are you feeling? Oh, and then Kevin, there's a possibility. I see the interest. I see the potential. Jim, how do you feel? Cautiously pessimistic. And everyone's like, what?
We were sure he said optimistic, but no.
Yeah, we had an odd congregation at that point. It was our congregation had aged quite a bit, and but to me, the great thing was we had empty children's rooms, empty nursery, and I thought that was a great match. You have plenty of kids to put in the empty nursery. And not many older people at all. So I thought the age issue was a good match. I thought my reason I was pessimistic was I was thinking that given your background, taking on all the issues of property and maintenance of old buildings and all that that you would soon flee.
I believe we called those property buildings and the maintenance, we used the word liability. Someone was like, "Oh, the asset of having a building," and we were like, "No, I think we think of it more as a liability than an asset."
Yeah, I mean, it's a huge opportunity, but I think the deferred maintenance that came with it, the weight of it was probably one of the harder things to consider.
Yeah,
particularly given the flexibility and we had at the time.
Yeah, I mean, as a church, we were mobile and flexible, and it was super relational for us at Shoreline.
Yeah, and
the idea of now we have to run a bigger organization felt like, are we going to be? Is there a potential for that to distract us from ministry? And it ends up we work through that and those kinds of things, but it's at the moment that's the initial thought.
Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about how we merged together and grew together as a leadership, and then want to talk about how the church and the church families grew together. But so by my recollection, and I pulled up, I've got a lot of documents, guys, from this time. I just realized I have merger timeline. I was just looking at merger timeline 4.0.
Oh gosh.
If anyone wants to do a Freedom of Information Act request, we can do a dump. We can dump them onto the website as a blog post. Maybe we haven't had a blog post in a while. I think we could dump it on there.
But best I can tell, I believe these conversations began in mid to late 2009.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Mid to late 2009. And so from there, us group of the pastors from First Baptist, and you and Kevin at the time, the pastors from Shoreline, Brian and I at the time, essentially a future pastor, and somebody who was, Steve Campbell was functioning in a pastoral role and heading up the deacons at the time and was a part of that. Matt as the next, and we at that point we envisioned him becoming a pastor at Shoreline shortly. So Matt was a part of that as well. How by your recollection, Jim, how did those conversations progress then, and what did that entail? How did we kind of grow together as a leadership?
Mike, we were meeting at around Stephen's dining room table. That's what time you're talking about.
Yeah.
And it didn't seem progressing to me. It seemed to be like arguing a lot about theology and issues and back and forth. And it felt very it felt stalled to me from just listening to it. And I'm thinking, is this going to work out? Is this worth the time for all of us to be putting into it to do this? So I was fairly, cautiously pessimistic. Partly because of that. We seem sort of stuck on a lot of issues of our theology. That's how it felt to me. And I'm panicking over, all of us getting fired by the board of trustees. And so I'm thinking, if we're going to do this, we have to do it. If we're not going to do it, we've got to not do it. But we haven't got a lot of energy or time to put into a slow move, because I think that'll kill it off. But that's exactly, I think, what God had in mind for us to do, a slow move and to continue to talk. Because as we went, it began to feel like something else was happening. We were talking diversive theological issues and the difference in our congregations and all kinds of issues like that. But in the meantime, it felt like we around the table were coalescing into something that seemed to work. And I had this realization at some point, I can't tell you exactly when, it was fairly far into those meetings, that this is pretty good. I don't know. This kind of works. And so
the pessimism slowly wanes.
Yeah.
This isn't totally horrible. That's right.
We can talk about this stuff, and we keep talking. We don't just quit and walk away. So I think at that point, it began to, in my mind, I thought the church is going to be wreckage anyway by the time we finish this battle. So we're going to have to rebuild. So why not add one more factor in, and just do that too. So that's, I think, how it began for me to grow into a reality.
Oh, man.
That's really interesting because I think, and for those who've been listening along, like there's this Constitution battle Jim talked about in one of the earlier volumes is going on. So
yes,
which to some degree was known to us at some point, but you had seen it coming far in advance, and we didn't. Like at Champagne Bakery, we weren't thinking about that. Mm-hmm. But every week for like a year or more, we sat around Campbell's table and used these. They weren't an excuse. So like we were talking about theology, we were talking about things. A lot of those conversations were less about differences. I was very surprised at how aligned we were, but our terminology sometimes was different, or like the way we talked about the same things took a while to go like, oh, okay. So when you say it that way, you mean it this way. We say it this.
Yeah.
Like that was a lot of it, a lot more than the actual differences. What was really happening, and this is fascinating to me, is we are around like this dining room table becoming like more and more cohesive, more and more united, and relationally.
Yes.
Which is why we needed all that time. While you're also experiencing, in some ways, the opposite in one of the harder times of like a church body feeling more relationally fractured and feeling more divided than I didn't know. I think we didn't really know until that got to more of a fever pitch that was actually happening simultaneously. So I think, of course, we were a little more optimistic.
Yes,
we were an agile 5-year-old church plant, barely. Didn't have a lot of politics to speak of. So to us, it's like, yeah, this sounds wonderful. And world weary Jim and the other side of the table.
And I think it was so fascinating about that time, that kind of switch. The way I remember it, at least, is when you guys were really in the trenches and things were looking really dark from your side, on the First Baptist side, I think the conversation switched from, let's talk about the possibility of our churches merging and what that potentially could look like and all these other things, to how do we can we just talk and pray together and be together, and how can we serve you? Like we spent a lot of time just hearing you guys through the battles that you guys were going through.
I remember that. You saying that. Yeah.
And just like, I think my heart and my affection grew for you and for the people you were trying to minister to in those meetings, in those conversations, where just seeing your heart for your people as a pastor, and then seeing the struggle and the suffering going on in the midst of kind of that being ripped apart in those ways, and just seeing your character, your desire to honor God, your desire to love and serve people well. It just it made me want to I was just praying for you guys every day and praying for the church every day. And my heart began to be burdened for you and for the church in a way that I think brought my affection for you and for Steve and for Kevin just to this deep, profound place in my own heart.
That's great to hear.
Yeah. Well, that's go ahead, Jim.
The issue I was going to address is we had a kind of a broken congregation that I think was what was so discouraging to me. The congregation that had been great back in the 40s, we've talked about this in previous podcasts, that they were terrific, and they continued to want the church to be what it had been at that point, and it had clearly moved on generationally and leadership-wise since that time. So I was getting a lot of complaining from people who didn't want all this battling going on. Why can't we just figure this out or something like that? That was just wearing me out, and I think it was causing more harm in the church at that point than good to try to work through the issues. But to work through the issues meant that people who did not have good theology would be the ones who decided what happened in the church, and who did not know what this church should be and could be. They were treating it like a business. We're going to be in charge. And so to me, it was a daily, waking up to a fairly frightening view of what was going on. And so I think coming to these meetings was the one encouraging point in my week, or however often we met.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, that's what I think. The question is like, what brought us together, what united us, and to me, that was the clincher. Because there's kind of this thing where it's like, at some level, Scott and I, we planted a church. It wasn't 100 years old, but it was a few years old, and it was so precious to us, and so woven into like what it meant for me to like my life. Like it was so woven into me. I don't think there's anything else that's like that I can really think of aside from maybe like marriage. It's just a really deep sense of personal investment and solidarity and unity. And so like, just because everything lined up on paper, to merge churches felt like such a risk. It felt like, okay, that's great that we line up in all these different ways. It's great that we feel a lot of collegiality amongst one another. But what gets you to take that next step, to commit yourself to another church body? And for me, like, and Scott and Matt, like, and for you guys to commit ourselves to one another. And that's what did it to me, was watching you guys weather what you weathered the way that you weathered it. I remember thinking at one point, we do that every week, and we're praying and I'm hearing stories and thinking of how both gracious and firm you were at different times with such wisdom. And I just remember thinking like, I'll go with these guys anywhere. Yeah. Like I see it. And I think that's what God used to really solidify us in that way. And after that, there was no way we could exist in some sense, to me, unmerged, at least in some way. Like we were together after that.
Yeah, there's definitely something connected and held.
100%. It was such a unique journey the Lord brought us through. And it's partially why, I mean, I may have mentioned this before, but it's why I don't know what to tell people when I get calls from pastors that are like, oh, we heard you merged your church. We'd love some guidance on how to do that. Right. Because
you're like, don't.
Because we did spend so much time so slowly working through the statement of faith and a constitution and philosophy of ministry and thoughts on programs and pastoral care. But that morphed over time. All of a sudden, those things both kind of got established, and in the importance of our conversations fell away as the pastoral care, as our care for you, as you and Steve and Kevin were going through this, and the bonding it created, the opportunity it gave us to see your character on full display. What I think left all of us just saying, man, I don't know what the Lord has, and I don't know what he has for our churches, but we want to walk forward one way or another together because we were so moved by the example of faithfulness that the Lord had done there. And I think it set an incredible example. And so that really, if we started talking in like mid 2009, late 2009, the theological conversations and stuff like that happened throughout the beginning of 2010. And then things hit a fever pitch in early 2010, and things got really rough here at First Baptist for you through that summer. And I mean, I remember at that point too, I think you expected that the vote was going to fail and you were going to get fired.
Yes.
And so we expected
office is packed up.
So we expected that the vote was going to fail and you were going to get fired. And you're like, I don't know, I guess, you can come worship with us if you want.
I was counting on it.
But at that point, then maybe fast forward a little bit, but the vote took place. And we talked about this in the previous episode. The vote took place. Those who opposed you resigned. And I remember meeting the week after that, right? All together. Yeah. And kind of just like weary, just wanting to be there for you and saying, oh, Jim, like you've been through this, like maybe we should just shelve this whole merge idea because this has been really crazy and let's just care for one another. And it was at that meeting, at least to my memory, that you, Jim, like after being cautiously pessimistic the whole time, like slammed the gas pedal down. We're like, no, we're good to go. Let's march to churches.
He walked into that meeting. He had like streamers, and he was like, popping bottles of champagne, and he had like shooting fireworks off.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, like, but you were more energized.
Oh, yeah.
Than I had ever seen you before,
Oh, yeah.
because this load had been lifted off.
Yeah.
And you were like, and you were just ready for whatever the Lord had next.
The future was open. Golly, it was wonderful. God.
So then we had to like bring these two congregations together
Yeah.
who didn't
Yeah.
really know much about each other and are kind of finding out about all of this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Can I, I want to jump into the next part, but Brian, since you're good at this, could you give the people a brief description of Steve Campbell and Kevin Elwell, because they're not here. I mean,
I know,
Steve's
they're not
around, and Steve was a pastor for a long time, and Kevin, but like even just a brief description to give some people a sense. I mean, Steve Campbell is larger than life.
He is indeed.
So can you give us like a brief?
Yeah. So Steve was an ex-sheriff.
Yeah.
Who kept the mustache. And he's bilingual in Spanish. His wife spoke mainly Spanish. And so we would sit around his dining room table. He was like an old-time Culver City resident. So he's one of the people that, like, in West LA had been here with roots for a long time. And he'd get pan dulce. So we can get donuts. We get pan dulce from his favorite pan dulce spot. And he would spend time. You could see from the kitchen table the other room where he had his flight simulator computer all set up with like all these like joysticks, and he'd just like fly to the Netherlands or something.
Which after he picked me up from getting my wisdom teeth taken out, that's what he had me do. He brought me back to his house after I got my wisdom teeth taken out, and I did the flight simulator. I'm just like for like an hour and a half just crashing planes into the ground over and over again as an anesthesiologist.
And so Steve loved John Piper.
Oh yeah.
He prayed like slow but serious. He kind of had this
Heavenly Father.
Yeah, this really unique and kind of fun lilt to his voice. He's one of the only guys I know who could walk to a supermarket in West LA and look at like the bagger and say, "Are you a church-going man?" And that would like work. Like that would start a conversation. Like he's just this kind of he's almost in a sense a generation behind us, above us. And that he had all of that. All of that gravitas and all of that kind of silliness in some ways kind of packaged together. So it's this really unique, he laughed a lot. Like he's a really unique character.
And just an incredible love for the church, for his people. Yeah.
Yeah. And he was a pastor. Like he really loved people and wanted to help them. He wanted to help them make better decisions. He wanted to help them get out of trouble. Like there were so many ways that he was here for no reason other than he cared for people in the church.
Yeah.
And Steve's still alive with us, but he's retired from serving here, and
he's taking care of his wife. He's
taking care of his family.
he's in that stage of life. And then Kevin was not of a previous generation. He was young and very excitable. Like Kevin, and he was kind of a perfect youth guy in some ways because he had that same like excitable energy.
Yeah.
And that's why this merge happened in some ways, is because that excitable energy got a hold of an idea and then God ended up using it. And so Kevin, who's now in Guam, pastoring in Guam, who was like from Guam, spent a lot of time in Guam when he was young. He was someone who, gosh, I mean, it's hard to encapsulate Kevin too. He's the guy that when he wanted a bigger youth room, just knocked down a wall in the community building without wondering if it was load bearing. And that kind of enthusiastic kind of energy, and almost innocence and excitement to learn. Like he was so humble in that way. Like he was our age, but he like was looking to us not as like we were superior to him, but he was just so ready to like listen as much as he was ready to speak, and that was just so great. He loved to be a part of what was happening in that way, and that was just so. It is hard to describe them, but these are two. Those guys were so formative to all that happened. It is weird to not have them in the room to talk about it, and yet that's just kind of another testimony to how God does this stuff. He moves people into places at times, and he doesn't stop doing stuff just because this one story is what we're talking about. There's other stories that are happening, with them.
Yeah, I think part of the reason this came about was because God was putting the right people on the right. You know, Steve, you described very well, and Kevin, and I was the moody pessimist in the group. So
we needed one of you.
The disgruntled veteran. The disgruntled veteran.
I was the brake, and they were the accelerator. You know? So you need both. But yeah, it seemed to me a perfect team. To do, when I look back on it, I mean, it didn't at the time. It was like, you know, what are we all doing here? This is 6 miscellaneous people. But looking back on that, it seems to me that God's placing of the right combination to actually walk this through in a realistic way and be able to talk about it and then make it come to pass. That's the stunning thing. That God brought that to a point where we could actually do that is, to me, it's impossible. It couldn't be done.
So that brings us to that question then.
Yeah, and what does the documentation say? Like, I remember the picnic. That's what do you got?
Okay, so the vote, the Constitution, First Baptist Constitution vote happened in like October.
Ken Paris brought a whole bunch of KFC. That's what I remember.
And at that point, you know, we say like we kind of hit, like things really started moving. And by really started moving, and this might be instructive actually for anybody who might someday be listening to this podcast and be like, how do I merge a church and what's the pace and how do I make this happen?
Really started
by
moving.
really started moving, I mean that we merged the churches 7 months later.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, it's still like this still, because we had gone through this process and we had grown together in a unique and spiritually deep ways.
The leaders.
But the churches hadn't yet.
Right.
And they kind of knew of each other, but that's when their journey was just starting. And we needed to give that the time and space. And so at that point, we, I think through the end of the year, did some kind of transitional means. We did some preaching swaps. We swapped preachers and preached for one another. Had some group meetings, and then in the beginning of the year, maybe in January, February, at least by my notes, we had we actually did. You guys remember this? We did dinners for 10.
That's right.
We mixed it like 5 people from First Baptist would just have dinner with 5 people from Shoreline and get together. We'd talk about different like programs, but that was where we had the big picnic.
Wait, it was our anniversary.
That's what it was.
So we would do a picnic.
Okay, so this was late
at the VA building.
2010.
Late in the VA building, federal building.
Park.
At the park behind the federal building. Every year we had done a picnic there, and it was our 5th anniversary, I think.
Yep.
And then Matt realized that it was also, we were like days away from First Baptist, like 111th anniversary or something. and so we were doing these like trivia games where we were asking questions of the other church. Yeah. And it was, that was the time that it felt like the most, like that we were the most foreign to each other as churches. Cause it was like, one of the questions was like, how many rooms are there on campus at First Baptist? And the Shoreline people were like, 6, I don't know, like 10. It's like 72 or so. It's like some ridiculous number. And the difference in age and like longevity and even just people. But that was where I think we realized that those complementary elements really were, they were truly complementary. And that was, to me, that's the big story of bringing the churches together, was realizing that this was an actual merger. One of the things I get from people when they ask me, okay, we're going to merge churches, is I kind of ask them, I kind of, to be really frank, I'm like, okay, is it a merger or is it an acquisition? Because I think a lot of church, they call them merges, but really it's one church that's big, sort of absorbing this other church that's small. And so that smaller church kind of gets woven into what the big church is already doing. For us, it really was like an equal amount of people, but just demographically different, historically, institutionally different. One had been around for 100 years, one that's celebrating its 5th anniversary, and excited about it, with a potluck. We had potlucks in common.
Like, look, we made it to 5 years.
We made it to 5 years. But I think that was where we had to figure out how to communicate that too. And so we were talking about being better together. It was like, why take 2 churches and make one bigger church? Like, well, actually, because we they have a kind of a dearth of people. First Baptist does. I'm gesturing at Jim, like a dearth of people from 20 to 35 or 40, give or take. and that's all we had. It's like, okay. Like, and the way that we kind of had this very kind of agile and kind of this kind of vision for West LA, and Jim had been telling us, along with Kevin and Steve, like, that's something that we want to have more. We feel like some of that has gotten stagnant with some of the things we've gone through recently and some of the institutional history we have. And we're like, well, institutional stability sounds cool. We're celebrating our 5th anniversary and really excited we made it. Like, so all this way of coming, it was like, we can actually reach West LA better together than apart. And that was a big part of trying to explain to the church families, here's why we're doing this. It's not just like getting bigger is better. It's because as you become one church family, we're actually better equipped to serve each other and to serve the city.
Yeah. And in the end, that was the answer to the question. When people ask why you merged, when we boiled it down, we kept saying it's because before God, we believe that we can reach West LA and disciple one another better together than we can apart, than we can as two distinct churches. And so, I mean, we did a Thanksgiving Eve service together. We did a Christmas Eve service together. And then I've got a whole list here of like areas to address that we had to like work all the way through.
I remember that.
Anyways, but
wait, hold on.
I'm not going to read them all.
Yeah. Come on, just go through one by one.
Elders, statement of faith, Sunday mornings, new church name, community, discipleship, pastoral care, children, youth, internal ministries, local outreach ministries, leadership development, global ministry, website, servant ministers, membership, finances.
Remember First Baptist website?
Property use.
Jim, your website was great. It actually probably would be back in vogue now.
We had the town hall meetings too.
So this is what I was going to say. So then in February, we began doing these. February and March, we had a unification sermon series.
Yeah.
Where we went through kind of making the case for why we believe this is what God wants to do. And then did these unification meetings. They were basically like town hall meetings to answer questions, to basically provide opportunity for people to to get around one another and learn one another. And Bill Kastenholtz asked if I was a 6-day creationist, and in front of everybody. And
and other people asked how Baptist we were and other things like that.
And I remember, and we were trying to present the name. We're thinking about maybe Cornerstone, like how are you? And I distinctly remember Marion Wells was like all for the name. She's like, you know
Love
what?
It.
This is great.
I love it.
This is the name, and we should just run for it, and we should just trust them, and we should spend our time worried about other stuff. Like she was just like, let's like it's just so great. I mean, we had such a great
because so many of the people who stayed from First Baptist were amazing.
Just
like and a lot of the people who left
that
were like part of this sort of the tribalism that was happening before. The people who were here, who remained, sort of the remnant, if you will, were just the most amazing, wonderful, godly.
They were very excited about it. They were very excited about it.
Many of which are still here today. I mean, just incredible. And so then we voted in each one of our churches, April 3rd. We and called each other afterwards, like, so what did your people say?
Okay, so the part of this story, and we talk about how difficult it was for us to commit to each other. This is a big ask for people to say, I'm now going to kind of submit myself and go under the leadership of, and like my church is going to be transformed. My community is going to be transformed, not just with other people, but with other pastors.
Yeah.
And so like that they don't know. It's like these questions and the process people went through took, it took months, and it also took risk. Like it took a kind of faith. Like it's not like this was a gimme, and it shouldn't have been. It shouldn't have been. Like as much as I do love Marion's response, like it's a name. Like just go with a name. For a lot of people, I really respect how seriously they took it because they weren't just like, whatever. Do whatever you want. Like they really cared about what these pastors believe, what this other church was like. Like to be family, you have to care. And people on from both congregations, they really cared. And I remember just being so kind of floored by that people were not floored. It wasn't like I was super surprised, but I was moved by like how seriously they took it. And it made me want to be like a better pastor. Like I need to kind of honor the seriousness with which they're inviting me in and vetting me as I come, because that means they're going to care about this church and what I am like as a pastor here.
That was, now that you mention it, that was a really, I think, unique experience, particularly for the two of us, because we planted the church when we were 25.
Yeah.
And in a sense, because of our age, because of our lack of experience, kind of just earned the opportunity to be a pastor in people's eyes who like knew us and who knew us well, and who came to know us well. But we weren't really used to the experience of somebody just like handing you that respect because you're a pastor and like inviting you to be their pastor. And so now 5 years later at 30, for a lot of people, especially a lot of people older than us.
Yeah.
This wasn't just, oh yeah, let's like merge our churches together. This will be fun. Oh, look what the Lord's doing. Like this was a conscious choice to say, this is what God wants for his church. And it's almost like hiring a new young pastor from their vantage point, right? It's like, I want to entrust myself to you to shepherd my soul. And I don't think we had a sense for that. Like we didn't necessarily think like that. Like our people didn't, because
we wouldn't really allow ourselves comfortably to be called Pastor Scott or Pastor Brian until after the merge.
That's true.
Because the people felt like people we had known for so long when we were so young.
Yeah.
It was only when we understood the seriousness of what it meant to have someone who didn't know us call us that I think we were like, okay, that's fine. I mean, when Marion would call me Pastor Brian, she's like, oh my gosh, like you don't correct that. Like you just take it and receive it and respect it, and you don't get awkward about it either. You just you embrace it.
But I mean, this is sort of that experience, I think, was a microcosm of our experience in those meetings that we had with the pastors.
100%.
Because there were, at some point along the way in those meetings, before the merge, before the votes, before we did all these other things, I remember looking at the two of you and thinking and saying, why do these guys listen to us?
Yeah.
Why do they listen to anything we have to say? Jim's been doing this for,
millions of years.
Yeah. Dude, it's going to be 50 years next year.
Jeez. Is it really? Oh, gosh.
100 years of this building and 50 years of you. And we're going to throw the biggest party with so much ice cream. It's going to be unbelievable. But
Which I probably won't be able to eat because, my doctor says I can't eat.
You do it anyways.
When was the last time you listened?
Yeah. Give me a break. Miriam Bechet told me this morning that you used to be considered the healthy guy around here, by the way. I don't know what that was all about. But anyways. But the idea of being 30, right? Yeah. And having someone in their 70s look at you and say, you're my pastor. That is shocking. And that is only something that comes from the Lord moving in the hearts of people in a really profound way.
But it's really good. It's a good thing to be able to do that. And I think that's, that God's, I think, caring for you all. I think the other piece of this is on my side, dumping on you like 50 and 60-year-old buildings that need serious repair, and all the mechanics of running a church, or just the administrative stuff. How are we going to set up governance and what that's going to look like, and what do we do with some of the people that really don't know you at all, but now you're the pastor, and they need. I mean, I remember seeing that and laying awake nights thinking, this is a potential nightmare in the making here as we're doing this. But I just feel like God's calling us through to make this work. And I was quite surprised, I have to admit, that some of the people I thought were going to be most oppositional were very glad that you were here, paid serious attention to when you're preaching, that the decisions we were capable of making, I thought were really, really good decisions, and our leadership structure worked. We didn't have boards and committees, but somehow we managed to make it anyway without those. I don't know how that happened. And it was so. I think we were all weary, but I think I was very weary from the last year before that. And so to see it running well, I think was a great delight to me, and very energizing. And just seeing new people come into the church as they heard about it. But I just was so impressed that you guys just stepped up and began to take care of all the business side and all the programming side that had to be done. And I think that coming out of venues, movie theater venues, and other issues like that, having a tractor trailer to pull your stuff around, it was incredibly encouraging to me.
Yeah. Well, okay, so let's talk a little bit about that first year, because we had these votes at the beginning of April. We had our first April 24th was our first service all together. It was Easter Sunday that year. We had Easter Sunday together. And then, so actually today's Palm Sunday. Palm Sunday was the last independent Sunday of First Baptist and of Shoreline. Palm Sunday was also two years before the day that our trailer got stolen. Yeah. So it's a meaningful day for all sorts of reasons. And Jesus.
Yeah, Jesus, yeah. It's meaningful for...
Stepped into that one. Oops.
This is a really important day to remember, guys, because our trailer got stolen.
I'm going to have to start the next podcast with an apology. We're going to, we met together on Easter, and then the Sunday after Easter, we had a Unification Sunday and made a covenant together. That was kind of a celebration of the unification, which was exciting. And then we were kind of off and running. And like a month later, Kevin moved to Guam.
Yeah.
I mean, is that the next story we should tell?
Yes, because we had this like marathon. I mean, Scott listed all those things to deal with. Jim talked about all the different things that were in front of us. And we had like an 8-hour day, maybe 10 hours of just together, like charting things out, figuring stuff out. Scott spearheaded this, is organizing it. We're trying to all collaborate to figure out what comes next.
Fill the chalkboard full of stuff.
Yeah,
we get done. And we're exhausted. And we basically had charted out like 6 months or a year, maybe longer, of like how this is all going to work with the three of us from Shoreline now, what used to be Shoreline, and what used to be First Baptist as pastors together. It's got 6 total. Everything's kind of figured out with those 6. And we're grabbing our bags. Like we're like putting stuff in our bags to go home after this long day. And Kevin does like this, one more thing, guys. And like, asked us to sit down. It's like, we kind of thought it was what? We'll put it on the board.
Yeah.
And he says, I'm moving to Guam. It's like, Guam? Like at that point, I think I'd heard the name Guam like twice. Once was in history class. But he had taken, what was
so during the time that things got really rough in the merge, or at First Baptist, Jim had told Kevin, you better prepare your resume.
Yes.
And Kevin had. And he had talked to his previous church where he and Melissa met on Guam, right? And have a history with the church there. Well, they were looking for a senior pastor, and I think in a lot of ways, it was like the one place that Kevin would leave here to go to. And the Lord just brought it together in this timing. And I think because things were so intense with the merge, because we were so excited, because there was so much momentum. I mean, we've talked about before, this is not exactly how you'd recommend going about this, but I understand how he just didn't know how to bring it up. Like didn't know how to share with us that there was this other conversation going on until he was basically back against the wall. He'd made the commitment. He had to tell, and he literally went through the whole meeting because he didn't know how to bring it up. And it was like, I can't leave this room without, I'm moving to Guam. And so, 2 months into this, the one who spearheaded this, the ones whose idea this was leaving First Baptist. And I think, or was leaving now Cornerstone, and which I think in retrospect, I think we were concerned about Kevin, and we were bummed because we wanted to serve together with him. We were also concerned with how it would appear to the church, like, oh, we've merged, but now we've gotten rid of Kevin.
Right.
Right.
Plus family ministries Like,
It's a huge deal.
kind of needed someone for that.
Yeah. And so,
And our 8-hour day was revolving around him being around for that. So
Yeah.
and so, but we in the end just trusted that the Lord had something for it. And, yeah.
Yeah, we were all convinced that this was not going to go, and I think that's during that time was when he thought, I've got to be able to provide for my family, and this job came up, and I couldn't blame him for taking it. That
No,
I think
totally.
made total sense. I just was sorry that it worked out that way. But
So a week later, I think we met again, and we're like, okay, what are we going to do? And Matt had basically committed to be a non-vocational pastor. He had a job. He was going to be a non-vocational elder here, but we were looking around the room.
he was dressing up as a penguin to sell math software at public schools. That's what he was doing. So, just to be clear, what he was sacrificing.
Exactly what I was doing. Dressed up as a penguin to sell math software. Just walking into
was the
random schools dressed as a penguin, selling. Hey, I want to sell
It
you
was the
some math
fairest
software.
way I could put it, man. It was the least prejudicial way to say it.
Actually, most families will know ST Math now, but I was working for them training teachers. But yeah, I mean, basically, we were sitting in that meeting and we were talking for a long time. What are the options? You have things like, do we hire from outside? Is there something else or someone else that can do it? And basically, I think what I said in that meeting was, "Why not me?" was the phrase.
Yep.
And everyone's like,
well, it turned out to be perfect timing. I think that was. I mean, I was sorry to lose Kevin, of course, but I thought that was the time if we were going to bring someone on, that was the perfect time to do it. So they weren't catching up.
Yeah. Yeah. And which I think providentially was exactly what
Exactly.
to do. I mean, it's just obviously over the last 10 years, having you freed up in that way has been just a huge blessing for the church. And I think something that wasn't a part of our plan, but the Lord was orchestrating in some incredible, perfect ways. Now, when you talk about the first year taking over children's ministry
a little bumpy
for a bunch of families.
That-
I mean, Shoreline, we were like the only family. There were like two families.
so I get to minister to Harper and Addison.
And all these families
Yeah,
at
no.
First Baptist that didn't know you.
Yeah, and then like the biggest program that First Baptist had was Awana at that time, and basically, and this is maybe not public knowledge, but the last thing that Kevin told me was, you should let it die. Like you should kill Awana.
And then he got on a plane.
And then he's like, all right, see ya. And I was like, what? I was like, wait, hold on a second.
Is this like Jerry Wilkie telling you, Jim, this church needs elders? See ya.
You should go take care of that.
Well, you were also 24, right?
I was 24.
We were 30, so that puts you at 24.
Yeah.
And dealing with family ministry. I mean, there's a lot there. And I think, we could go around the circle and talk about it.
No, but I mean,
think
God
you did
was-
a great job.
Yeah, no, it's not a matter of that. It's just like a huge learning curve and trying to figure out how to minister well to families. And it was an exciting time for me for a variety of reasons. But
I mean, I think so many families were so blessed by that time. And I think you're right. There was learning curves and difficulties. But I mean, I think of like it's interesting. I mean, when my kids and kids their age think back to like growing up at Cornerstone, those were the years. Like that was, and it was, and you know what? I think in a similar way, it was bumpy across the board. Yeah. Like it did work incredibly, but there was also this sense where I think it's kind of like a church plant. Like people love a church merge because they're like, this is going to be great. This is going to turn the church into my dream church.
Yeah.
And when it actually requires work and sacrifice and isn't just your dream church, but is like the Lord's doing something else, I think that there were, as amazing as the merge was, there were also a lot of expectations that came with it that people had to process through, that all of us had to process through. And I think that everyone in the church had to process through. In a way that's, again, being brought through that has been incredible. It was a huge blessing to get on the other side of it, but it wasn't simple for sure. It wasn't simple for sure.
It was from my perspective, it was a total answer to prayer. And the funny thing was, I wound up not being involved for the first several months. Because of a car accident. And
Kevin goes to Guam.
Kevin goes to Guam. I'm flat on my back in bed at home.
In bed for months.
And
right?
you guys, here you go. Good luck. But it worked, and I thought, it was probably a huge learning curve in some ways. But I think that the hand of God on that whole situation. I think that my stepping back and not being available was probably one of the great things that happened, because you innovated, you picked up, you I think got a clear view of what needed to be done and moved, I think, very effectively to reorganize the church in all kinds of ways. We lost some people, we gained some people, and I think that was a kind of turnaround and an adjustment that has put us in the situation where we are today, where the church is prospering and doing very well. So it was very frustrating to me not to be part of that, but it was very exciting for me to know that was happening. So I was pretty happy.
Well, I think as we reflect back on that, I think there's lots of other stories we could tell, but we should probably just leave it there for now. The thing that stands out to me again, like you've heard it kind of in bits and pieces, but like it would be fun to be able to say, we all had this great idea and look at what we did. But I think we all, in various times and in various moments, were just weak vessels that the Lord used to display his glory in both as pastors and as church members. I think so many people were along for the ride, and they were along for the ride not because they trusted us implicitly, but because they trusted the Lord.
Mm-hmm.
They trusted what God was doing. They saw him do it, and they knew that what he had in store was more than they could ask or imagine.
That was the name. Like, I think Cornerstone apparently is the most popular,
most common,
church name in the United States. And I think when people hear Cornerstone, they just go, "Oh, right, like church."
Yeah.
But we picked that name on purpose, and I think most people now who don't remember the merge don't. You wouldn't know that. But we picked a name ideally that was going to honor the cornerstone that First Baptist had been in this place. There's a literal cornerstone.
Yeah, there's actually a cornerstone,
on the bottom of the bell tower that you can see from when the building was built. And how also we at Shoreline had to rely on just Jesus, the cornerstone, to survive for 5 years, and how those two things were coming together to be able to move that forward. To have, like, the only way a merge is going to work is if the different parts distributed the support that was needed onto Christ as cornerstone, and that was what happened. That's why it happened. That's why it survived. That's why we're here today. And I think that name, therefore, will have meaning, that same meaning going forward. It's not just looking back. That same thing needs to keep happening. And I think of that first Easter, you say better together, a cornerstone. I remember getting up to preach that first Easter when we were at one church, and very front row, the place was packed, very front row, on just the two different aisle seats of the pews, right in front of the pulpit, there was a man who was, I think he was almost 100. It was Patty Witt's husband, if I remember right.
Oh, okay.
He's in a wheelchair, and he kind of came up and slid into the seat. And right across the aisle was a woman holding a baby that couldn't have been more than like 2 months old. And I was like, this is it. Like, this is Cornerstone. Like, this is it. Like, this is us coming together and having all this range.
Here's your range.
Leaning on Jesus together and doing this together in this city. And we're going to have another Easter next week. And it's going to be the same experience. Like, we're going to be doing the same thing going forward. And I love retelling these stories because it just reminds you that this Easter isn't different. It's not a different Easter, and it's not a different Cornerstone. It didn't just magically become a random name for a church. All that significance is still in it for us. So I think there's something really beautiful about looking forward because we've looked back.
Yeah. That's so powerful. And I think what stands out to me is what was unique about that is actually one of the things that's reverberated. It's what's made it possible to be a multilingual church.
Yeah.
Was that we had gone through this merge, that we had it's part of what the Lord's used to shape the church as it is today. And so even as we talk maybe in the next episode about how that's developed over the last decade. It's reverberations of what he did then that he keeps doing over and over, just in different ways and different directions, and what he's going to continue to do, both in this local church, but even more significantly in his church, till he returns. So thanks, guys. This is fun.
Jim, how are you feeling about the future of this church?
Cautiously optimistic.
Oh, wow.
Well, thanks, guys. Yeah, this is for the moment. I felt differently earlier, but I've had my coffee. This is fun, man. It's sweet to get to retell and recount and consider all the Lord's done, and to look with anticipation at all He has in store.
Jim, you asked us how long. I don't know if I mentioned this before, but you asked us how long during the process how long we planned on staying here. You said how long you plan on staying here. I remember writing down on a piece of paper like 75 years and then just handing it to you.
Slid it across the table.
Yeah. So here we are 12 years later.
That's right.
Okay, so a few more to go.
A few more to go.
That's right. Well, thanks, guys. Thank you all for listening. Thanks for being a part of this story, and particularly for those of you who were a part of it through that season. Thank you for the unique roles in each of your different spheres and ways that God allowed you to play in bringing these churches together and in forming the family that is Cornerstone today. So we're humbled to get to be a part of it with you. Mm-hmm. So thank you for your faithfulness. Thanks for being a part of it with us. And thanks for listening. We love you, and we'll see you on Sunday.